Hi everybody, welcome back. If you bear with me today, in this lecture what we're going to do is discuss why use ASP, a little background, and we'll focus in on the evolution of web development. So what we'll do is we'll start off and take a look at the big picture, talk about basic HTML and how we went to client-side programming and server-side programming, and the difference between static and dynamic content. And we'll talk about what ASP actually does for us, where it's used. And then we'll finish up and talk about the different flavors of ASP.NET and why I chose to focus on web forms. Now, the web has existed for almost 3 decades. In that time, the way websites look and feel have changed dramatically. The way people create websites has also evolved. Today, web pages are written by hand, perhaps with the help of a tool such as Adobe Dreamweaver, or they can be programmed using one of the more powerful platforms. ASP.NET is Microsoft's web programming toolkit. It's part of a .NET cluster of technologies that are designed to help developers build a variety of applications. Developers write the code in one of several core .NET languages, such as C#, which is the language we're going to use in this course. Okay, let's start off with basic HTML. It would be difficult to describe early websites as web applications. Instead, the first generation of websites often looked more like brochures, consisting mostly of fixed HTML pages that needed to be updated by hand. A basic HTML page is a little like a word processing document. It contains formatted content that can be displayed on your computer, but it doesn't actually do anything. The following example shows HTML at its simplest with a document that contains a heading and a single line of text. Now, the figure below that I'm going to show you is a simple HTML page in the browser. So this is how that sort of HTML code would look in a browser. It's just a fixed rule file, in this case called samplewebpage.htm, that contains the HTML content. It has no interactivity, doesn't require a web server, and certainly can't be considered a web application. Next up, HTML forms. HTML2 introduced the first seed of web programming with a technology called HTML forms. HTML forms expanded HTML so that it would include not only formatting tags, but tags for graphical widgets or controls. These controls included things like drop-down lists, text boxes, and buttons. Here's a sample web page created with an HTML form control. Now, in an HTML form, all the controls are placed between the form tags. The preceding example included 2 checkboxes represented by that input type checkbox and a button and a BR element which adds a break between the lines. So here is how the code, the HTML code, would look on a web browser. Okay, now HTML forms allow web developers to design standard input pages. When the user clicks the submit button on the page, shown as you see here, all the data in the input controls, in this case the 2 checkboxes, is patched together into one long string of text and sent to the web server. Now on the server side, a custom application receives and processes the data. In other words, if the user selects a checkbox or enters some text, the application finds out about it after the form is submitted. Amazingly enough, the controls that were created for HTML forms more than 15-20 years ago are still the basic foundation that you'll use to build dynamic ASP.NET pages. The difference is the type of application that runs on the server side. In the past, when the user clicked a button on a form page, the information might have been emailed to a set account or set to an application on the server that used the challenging CGI or Common Gateway standard. Today, you'll work with a much more capable and elegant ASP.NET platform. Next up, let's talk about ASP.NET. Early web development platforms had 2 key problems. First, they didn't always scale well. As a result, popular websites would struggle to keep up with the demand of too many simultaneous users, eventually crashing or slowing down. Second, they provided little more than a bare-bones programming environment. If you wanted higher level features such as the ability to authenticate users or read a database, you needed to write pages of code from scratch. Building a web application this way was tedious. So to counter these problems, Microsoft created a higher level development platform. First ASP and then ASP.NET. These technologies allow developers to program dynamic pages without worrying about the low-level implementation details. Even better, ASP.NET is stuffed full of sophisticated features. including tools for implementing security, managing data, storing user-specific information, and much more. And amazingly enough, it's even possible to program an ASP.NET page without knowing anything about HTML. Hooray! Although a little bit of HTML will probably help you. Okay, now let's focus in on the kinds of web programming. Basically, there's two types. There's a server-side and client-side programming. Now, ASP.NET, which stands for Active Server Pages, is designed first and foremost as a server-side programming language. That means that all the ASP.NET code runs on the web server. When the ASP.NET code finishes running, the web server sends the user the final result as an ordinary HTML web page that can be viewed in any browser. Another server-side programming language is PHP, which stands for Hypertext Preprocessor. Now, server-side programming isn't the only way to make an interactive web page. Another option is client-side programming, which asks the browser to download the code and execute it locally on the client's computer. Just as there is a variety of server-side programming platforms, there are various ways to program client-side programming, from snippets of Java code that can be embedded right inside the HTML of a web page to plugins such as Adobe Flash and Microsoft Silverlight. All right, let's do a little recap now in the first part of the course, the evolution of web development. So there's basically two kinds of web pages. There's static ones and there's dynamic. In the static ones, typically they have a .html at the end of them. They're HTML files. They return the same thing each and every request. So if you need to update the content, you have to update the HTML file. Dynamic content, ASP.NET Web Forms, like we're going to learn in this course, they usually have a .aspx ending. They contain dynamically generated content. No need to update the ASPX files for new content. All the code runs on the web server. The final result is sent back to the client as ordinary HTML. Also, a lot of the information typically drawn for this dynamic page comes from things like a database. Okay, so what's ASP.NET going to do for us? Well, using ASP.NET, you can create e-commerce sites like Amazon.com, data-driven portals, and just about anything else you can find on the internet. Now, there's a number of flavors of ASP.NET if you've been looking around the internet. For example, web forms, the kind of thing we're going to learn in this class. These are websites and web applications. A newer one is called the Model View Controller, MVC, and the newest one is Core. Now, this course is aimed at anyone who wants to create dynamic websites with ASP.NET Web Forms. Best of all, you don't need to paste together a jumble of HTML and script code. Instead, you create the full-scale web app using nothing but C# and a design tool like Visual Studio. Now, getting back to the different flavors, the MVC Model View Controller and Core offer different ways to build dynamic web pages. To some, MVC and Core are cleaner and more suited to the web. To others, it's just a lot of extra effort with no clear payoff. Either way, you need a strong knowledge of basic ASP.NET, which you'll learn in this course, before moving on to the newer technologies, which can be a bit more challenging at first light. Thanks for hanging on. I know it was a bit wordy, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background. Maybe you knew it, maybe you didn't, but this will give you a good base from where you can build on the knowledge you're going to learn in this particular course. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next lecture.